in itself is a very, very important topic. And when it's related to current legal knowledge, again, it becomes more important. I'm very happy that back again with us, we have Avinosa, who has agreed to take a very, very important lesson on the developments in and around Indian Constitution. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, hi. So guys, in today's lecture, we'll be talking about and we will be discussing certain important topics vis-a-vis the Indian Constitution and what has happened recently. Now, the thing is, I'm going to be very blunt with you today. I will not be discussing things like the Citizenship Amendment Act or NRC, right? Because obviously the thing is, your paper was supposed to happen very soon. Now, if you have no idea what the NRC is or what the CA is by now, as in like by the end of September, then you're by the end of August, you're in for a very rude shock because then paper nahi clear hoga aapka, right? So you have to know about these larger issues. What I want to focus this lecture specifically on, that there are certain other pieces of news that have happened over the last 1 year, and they are fairly important in the sense that you can have paragraph based questions out of those. Now obviously we will have to discuss certain provisions of the constitution. However, if you look at your current affairs syllabus, it says, and there's a specific guideline I think vis-a-vis legal issues, it says that anything, and like let's say there is a question on legal issues, then your knowledge of law will not be tested apart from what is mentioned in those paragraphs, right? Obviously, because you're studying to be lawyers and you're not lawyers as of now. You're not supposed to know all of these things. However, when we come to the Constitution of India, then that's slightly different because it has far greater significance than any other law, and you're supposed to know a little bit about the Constitution specifically, right? So having said that, let's just proceed with today's lecture on polity. Okay, 1 second. 1 minute. So the chat is also active if anyone of you has any questions that you want to ask. Okay. So let's discuss some important things that have happened in the last 1 year vis-a-vis polity. Okay. So the first thing that I want to discuss here, which has been in the news, is addition of certain scheduled tribes. Okay. So the thing is, apart from the fact that this is a constitutional concept and you have to know what scheduled tribes are and what are the criteria for appointment of scheduled tribes, I believe that this from polity can very well come in the form of a paragraph when they quiz you on the criteria for classifying certain tribes as scheduled tribes, and they can also give you specific names of certain tribes, that this tribe dash is found in so and so state, right? So I'm going to mention a few tribes here, but I think you should generally, if you have time, you should just Google and try to figure out the important tribes that have been in the news, right? Because they make a very pet objective type question, wherein they can give you a blank and then they will say that this blank, and they'll talk about certain tribes, and then they'll ask you what tribe is being referred to here, right? So let's come to what has happened in recent year. So there is a bill, which is the Constitution Scheduled Tribes Amendment Bill 2019, which was passed by the Parliament recently. Now, what this bill does is that it gives the status of scheduled tribe to certain communities in Karnataka. Okay. Now, the communities that are specifically included in the bill, there are 3 tribes: the Parivar tribe, the Talavara tribe, and the Siddhi tribes of Belgavi, Dharwad in Karnataka. Okay. So apart from this, I'm not going to go into the details of the bill. It's a very short bill. It just says that these tribes are now members of the scheduled tribes. I will talk about who are the Siddhi tribes, right? Because Siddhi tribes, because of this bill and another thing that happened recently that we will discuss, has now become very important. Okay. Now, Siddhis are like a tribal group. Okay. You find Siddhis not only in Karnataka, but you find Siddhis in Gujarat as well. Okay. Now, these are the ethnic groups who trace their descents, as in their ancestors are the Bantu people from Southeast Africa. Now, when the Portuguese merchants came into India, they brought some of these Bantu people with them and into the Indian subcontinent to work as slaves for these Portuguese merchants, right? So these Bantu people now, as they exist in a community known as the Siddhis. So there are about 50,000 Siddhis in India, and more than 1/3 of them live in Karnataka. Okay. Now, recently, why the Siddhi tribe has also been in the news for other reasons is because recently Mr. Shantaram Siddhi became the first person of African origin to become a member or to become a legislator in India. Okay, he was elected and nominated to the Legislative Council of Karnataka, right? So he's an MLC in Karnataka, and he's the first person of African origin to ever become a legislator in India. Okay. Now, what you should know is that obviously this bill gives the designation of scheduled tribes to these tribes, but there has to be certain criteria based on which you can classify a community as scheduled tribes, right? Because the thing is, once you are classified as scheduled tribes, the state has an extra responsibility towards maintaining and preserving your culture, language, etc. And apart from that, the state also gives you certain benefits in the form of reservations for jobs and educational institutes, right? So the criteria which has to be followed for one community to be, let's say, nominated or mentioned as a scheduled tribe is this. The first is that there are indications of primitive traits. Okay. So the thing is, like, they are distant from the society in the sense that their social structure, their sort of way of life is very, very different from the sort of social structure and way of life we see prevailing in contemporary India. Okay. Second is that they should possess a distinctive culture. I mean, their culture should be very different from the larger part of the country. Then is geographical isolation. Now, there are certain tribes which are geographically isolated. So you'll find certain tribes in Northeast India, certain tribes in J&K, certain tribes in Himachal Pradesh who have this tribal status because they are very, very geographically isolated. Okay. For example, there was this tribe that was recently in the news, the Sentinelese people of Andaman and Nicobar Islands, right? One white guy, some missionary, had tried to visit them and try to like preach the teachings of Jesus Christ to them, but these guys just shot him with bows and arrows and killed him, right? So this important tribe, the Sentinelese tribe, also is something that you should remember. There could be a question on this. Now, another important tribe from the Andaman itself is the Jarawa tribe. Now, I obviously can't mention each and every tribe, but you should try to Google the important tribes that were in the news. Okay. Just say, for example, because of, let's say, the Chinese intrusion into India, that specific region wherein they're coming into Ladakh, that is inhabited by this tribe called the Changpa tribe. Okay, so then obviously there can be a question vis-a-vis the Changpa tribe itself, right? Now, the criteria that I mentioned, the tribe does not have to fulfill all of those criteria. It's not an and-based criteria, it's an or-based criteria, right? So let's say a tribe qualifies under any of those criteria, right? Primitive traits, distinctive culture, geographical isolation, shyness of contact, okay, and backwardness. Then if any of these conditions is satisfied, then one tribe or one group of people can be designated as a scheduled tribe. Now, this criteria is never explicitly mentioned in the constitution, but over the years, it has become well established, right? Now, the second thing that I want to discuss is the pardoning power of the president. This has also been in news because a lot of high-profile convicts have been applying to the president for pardon or reprieve or respite. Okay. Now, the power of the president to grant any sort of, let's say, pardon, etc., comes from Article 72 of the Constitution. Okay. Now, Article 72 talks about pardon, but it also talks about certain other things like reprieves, respites, or remission of punishment, right, or suspension or commutation of sentence of any person convicted of any offense. Okay. So obviously, let's discuss what these specific words mean. So pardon, as it is very clear in common parlance also, it means completely absolves from all sentences and punishment, right? So when a president gives a pardon, that means that not only is the punishment done away with, the very fact that the person is pronounced guilty in a court of law is also done away with. Okay. So the president effectively overrules the court and says that this person is not guilty and therefore he should not deserve any punishment. Now, the second power that the president has under Article 72 is commutation. So commutation means to replace the punishment with a less severe punishment, right? So let's say the High Court or the Supreme Court has jailed somebody for 14 years. Now, under commutation, the president can say, okay, let's jail this person for 10 years or 12 years or 7 years. They can reduce the severity of the punishment. Okay. Now, reprieve means temporary suspension of a death sentence. So in most of the cases, when, let's say, the people apply, as in people request the president, okay, now most of these convicts are death row convicts, and in the meantime that the president is taking this decision, there is a reprieve given to them, which means that for the duration of time that the president is contemplating on whether to give them a pardon or commutation or anything, they are not put to death, and this temporary suspension is known as reprieve. Okay. Then there is respite, which means that awarding of lesser punishment on some special grounds like pregnancy, etc. Right? Let's say there's an old man in the jail today, and he's 85 years old. Okay, and he has 10 more years to serve. But the president of India says that, okay, there is a pandemic going on in the entire country. There's a high chance that if this person contacts COVID in the jail, though he is punished for imprisonment only, there's a very high likelihood of him dying because he's old and he, let's say, he's also diabetic, right? So he's comorbid as well, right? So the chances of him dying are very, very high. So based on these special grounds, the president can give respite to that person and they can give some lesser punishment. So the president can remove, let's say, the 5 years that he has left to serve, and the president say, okay, he's already served an X number of years, and therefore a respite is being given. Okay. Now, remission is reduction of the amount of sentence without changing its character. Okay, so there are two forms of imprisonment in India. For example, one is regular imprisonment and the second one is rigorous imprisonment. So rigorous imprisonment basically means that you have to also perform a lot of labor. So if you look at those movies that you 70s, 80s, and a lot of movies that came out where the prisoners are breaking stones, they're doing a lot of hard work, that sort of imprisonment is known as rigorous imprisonment. Okay, so remission basically means that the nature of the punishment would remain the same. So let's say someone has to undergo rigorous imprisonment for 14 years. If the president says that, okay, let it be rigorous imprisonment, I am not changing the character of this punishment. However, let it be rigorous imprisonment for 10 years. So that is known as remission. Okay. Now, the president can exercise this power given to him or her under Article 72 under three primary conditions. Okay, the first is when the punishment of sentence is by court martial. In that means that if the punishment is by a military court. Now you must know by now that the president is the nominal as the supreme commander of the armed forces. Therefore, all the armed courts, army courts, and navy or air force courts also come under the president. So if a person has been given a sentence by court martial, okay, the president has the direct power to reduce the sentence or pardon him. Okay. Now, in all cases where punishment or sentence is for an offense under a law related to matter to which executive power of the union exists, right? So there are certain laws that the states can make, and there are certain laws that the center can make, right? So if, let's say, the punishment is given under the state law, then the similar power to grant to reduce sentence, etc., vests with the governor of the state, because the punishment is given under a law formed by that particular state, right? Now, if the punishment is given under any law that is formed by the center, then obviously only the president has the power to pardon. The governor does not have this power. And C is in all cases where the sentence is a sentence of death. Okay. So even under a state law, if, let's say, the High Court says that the person has to be put to death, the governor cannot pardon, even though the law is a state law. Only the president has the power to pardon a death sentence. Okay. Now, this power of the president, the word president here is a bit of an anomaly because the president here does not have a lot of discretion, right? So this power is exercised on the advice of the Council of Ministers, which effectively means that the power center here is still the Prime Minister. So the president, even though it says pardoning power of the president, you have to realize that under the Indian Constitution, president is only a nominal head. Okay, president is only the rubber stamp. The real power vests with the Prime Minister and the cabinet or the Council of Ministers, right? So when the president grants a pardon or president grants a reprieve or a respite, it effectively means that he does it under the advice of the Council of Ministers, and the advice of the Council of Ministers is binding. If, let's say, the Council of Ministers says, please do not pardon him, then the president can't go out of his way to pardon that person. Similarly, if the Council of Ministers says that please pardon this person, the president cannot say that, no, I'm not going to pardon this person. Okay, so the president is bound by the advice of the Council of Ministers. Okay. Now, third thing that has been in the news recently is the anti-defection law. Okay, so anti-defection law is a law that I want to talk to you about because it's a very interesting piece of legislation. Now, why this has been in the news? Because recently, Karnataka Assembly Speaker tried to disqualify 17 MLAs. Okay. And the Supreme Court said that, okay, the decision by the Karnataka Assembly Speaker to disqualify these MLAs is fine. Okay. So therefore, it again brought the anti-defection law into the picture. Okay. Now, anti-defection law effect does not, it came out very late. It came out in the 1980, it came out in 1985. So by the 52nd amendment to the constitution, a schedule 10 was inserted into the constitution. Schedule 10 of the constitution deals with anti-defection law. Okay. So the reason why anti-defection law was introduced is because at that point of time, yes, Arushi Pathak says, Ayaram Gyaram, exactly. So basically there was this guy who basically changed 3 to 4 parties in a single day, right? Because somebody said, "Aap hamare paas aa jao, we need 1 seat, we will give you the post of this minister." Then another party said, "No, no, you come with us, we will give you a better post," right? So this guy was nicknamed as Ayaram Gayaram because subah kisi aur party mein tha, and by the evening he was in some other party. Okay. Now to deal with this particular issue, the anti-defection law is introduced. But the problem is, like most laws in India, they are done and they are introduced with a very good and noble intention, but after a point of time people find loopholes and people start misusing these laws. Okay. So so this law very specifically says that legislators both of the parliament and of the state legislative assemblies can be disqualified on the grounds of defection by the presiding officer of a legislature. That means speaker of the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha or the speaker of the legislative assemblies. Okay. Now what constitutes defection? There are two particular, let's say, categories of defection. The first is if a person voluntarily gives up the membership of his party, right? So he says, I am no longer a member of the party, then that person is deemed to have defected under the definition of defection under anti-defection law. Second is he disobeys the directive of the party leadership on a vote, right? So let's say if I am a party whip, so there's this post of the party whip. It's an informal post. The role of a party whip is to ensure that the lawmakers attend the legislative assemblies or the parliament, and then they vote according to what the party tells them to, right? So if a person does not go with, okay, started raining. Okay, so if a person, am I audible properly? Because like my roof is sounding a lot. Can you tell me if there's an issue, Harsh?
You are audible to me.
Okay, cool. So, okay. So a legislator, so first thing is if he voluntarily gives up the membership of the party. The second is if he disobeys the directive of party leadership on vote. Okay. Now this law applies to both parliament and state assemblies. Now you can see the problem with the anti-defection law, right? It effectively means that the MLAs and the MPs now have no power vis-a-vis debates and discussions, right? So any form of debate, so the purpose of having parliamentary debates is to make sure that you inform the lawmakers about the nitty-gritties of the issue, and then they can vote on that issue so that a bill can become a law, etc. Right? Now the thing is, with anti-defection law coming into the picture, the debates have very less value, because if the party tells a particular MP or an MLA that you have to vote for the bill or you have to vote against the bill, then there is nothing that person can do. Even if the person abstains or votes against the party, then that person is subject to disqualification. Now, obviously, nobody wants to be disqualified. Therefore, all the people end up voting along party lines, and that reduces the importance of parliamentary debates. So, since 2014 specifically, a lot of parliamentary debates have gone out of fashion. People do not, our lawmakers are not debating a lot of important things, because under the anti-defection law, it doesn't matter. If the party head has said that you have to vote against the bill or you have to vote for the bill, then that's the only thing that these people can do. Okay. Now, obviously, there are certain bona fide exceptions to the anti-defection law. The first is, let's say, if there is a party. So the first disqualification is if a member says that I am no longer a member of this party, right? So if an individual can do that, then that is defection. However, if let's say a party says that we want to merge into another political party, and 2/3 of the member of that political party are okay with leaving this particular party and joining another party, then that act of them leaving this party and going to another party will not be considered to be an act of defection, and then that MP or an MLA or the group of MP or an MLA will not be disqualified under the anti-defection law. Okay. The second thing is, if a person becomes, let's say, the speaker of the Lok Sabha, chairman of the Rajya Sabha, or even if they become the, let's say, speaker of the legislative assembly, then obviously the role of the speaker has to be such that the speaker has to be non-partisan, right? The speaker is not supposed to take the party sides. Therefore, a person on becoming the speaker can say that, okay, I am becoming the speaker, therefore I am leaving my membership of the party, But when at a later date that person ceases to be the speaker, then that person can come back and say that then that person can later join the party, and therefore he or she is not disqualified. Okay. Now, what the Supreme Court told the Parliament is that the Parliament said that so as of now, the power to decide whether an act is an act of defection, the power lies with the chairperson of that house. So the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, the Chairman of the Rajya Sabha, or the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. So the Supreme Court said that for legislative assemblies, let's not give the exclusive power to the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, and it asked the central government to form a specific law on this and give powers to other functionaries as well. Okay. Now, under the anti-defection law, the law specifically states that the decision of the presiding officer of the house is not subject to judicial review. So, judicial review basically means that the courts can intervene and overturn any decision. Okay. Now, this is what the law specifically says. But however, there is this very important case known as Kyoto Holohan versus Zaichilu. This came out in 1992. Herein, the Supreme Court interpreted the law and said that when the presiding officer of that house is deciding on a matter of disqualification, then that presiding officer acts like a tribunal, and it's a quasi-judicial proceeding where evidence has to be given, where arguments have to be given, and based on those evidence and arguments, a decision has to be taken, right? So therefore, the chairperson of that house acts like a tribunal, and therefore, any order passed by a tribunal is subject to judicial review. Therefore, any act of disqualification by the chairman of the house is after 1992 also subject to judicial review. Okay. So this next thing that has been in the news a lot, this happened in Delhi also last year. Now it has happened in other states as well, is the issue of office of profit. Okay. Now this term office of profit, I don't know why people are very confused by what office of profit means. It's a very simple thing. Okay. So let's first tell you why office of profit is important, as in what are the laws and where does the constitution talk about office of profit. Okay. So article 102 and 191 say that if an office bearer, that is MP in the parliament or MLA in the legislature, in the state legislature, if one of the grounds for their disqualification from such post of MP or an MLA is that they hold an office of profit. Okay. But what an office of profit is not defined in the constitution. It is not defined under the Representation of People Act. So Representation of People Act is a very important act which talks about elections, which talks about the power of, as in it talks about disqualifications, etc. of these MPs and MLAs. Okay. Now, in this important case called Pradyut Bordoloi versus Swapan Roy case, the Supreme Court said that there are certain important tests that have to be followed to determine what the office of profit is. Okay. So the first question is whether the government has made the appointment. The second is whether the government has the right to remove or dismiss the holder of that particular office. The third is if the government pays him or her any money. Okay. The fourth is whether the holder of this office performs any functions for the government. And the fifth is that does government exercise any control over the performance of these functions by this particular MP or an MLA, right? So the reason why the constitution says that somebody who is a part of the legislature cannot hold an office of profit is very simple. Okay. So the constitution envisages some sort of, let's say, a separation of power between the legislature, executive, and the judiciary. Okay. Now the thing is, if an MLA or an MP holds an office of profit, that means that that particular MLA or an MP is also a part of the executive, right? So the thing is, the constitution does not want the lawmakers to at any point of time be put under any sort of pressure by the executive so that they can carry out the function of lawmaking properly without any sort of interference from the executive. So this is the underlying beliefs and the underlying idea as to why office of profit is important, right? So if you're an MLA or an MP, you basically cannot hold an office under the government of India or a state government, okay? Because then you might be subject to certain pressure from your bosses and seniors who also inevitably will be a part of the executive. Okay. Now, in a very important, interesting case, Jaya Bachchan versus Union of India, Supreme Court said that office of profit is not necessarily an office which actually gives out salary or money or any pecuniary gain. If it has the potential to yield or provide you with any sort of profit, even though no salary or payment is actually being given, then also it qualifies as an office of profit. Okay. Now the next topic that I'm going through a list of like topics quickly, right? Because the thing is I want to cover as much as possible in this video, because the thing is the broader questions of law is not something that are going to be asked to you apart from constitution law. Therefore, I'm going to cover certain important articles of the constitution, right? Because these are important articles that have been in the news, and these are the articles that you're supposed to know. Okay. Now, recently, there has been a controversy regarding the promotion of Hindi language. It's not a recent controversy. This controversy has been happening since 1950s, okay? But recently, again, it's been in the news because of the new education policy where they started talking about the three language formula, okay? Now, before going on to what the three language formula is and whether promotion of Hindi should be there or not, let's look at certain facts and let's look at certain constitutional provisions which talk about Hindi, okay? Now, under Article 351, the Constitution says that it's the duty of the Union government to A, promote the spread of Hindi, to develop that it may serve as a medium of expression, okay, to secure enrichment by assimilating. So basically, it says that Hindi has to be promoted. Then Article 120, which refers to the Parliament, and Article 210, which refers to the state legislature, says that the transaction of business can be in Hindi, English, or any other regional languages. Okay, so in the constitution, it only says Hindi and English, and later on, the legislative assemblies of the states have said that obviously not every state would want to conduct its practice business in Hindi. So some states have introduced their state language as well. Now, under Article 343, very specifically, it states that Hindi, which is written in the Devanagari script, okay, is to be the official language of the union, and it gives powers to the parliament to decide by law the language to be used for official work. Okay, so this is specifically covered under Article 343, and Article 344 says that every 10 years, a parliamentary committee has to be formed, which will then give its recommendation to the presidents regarding the use of Hindi language and restriction on the use of English language. Right? So every 10 years, the use of English language is carried forward, but the constitution, the idea of the constitution from the very beginning was such that Hindi should become the lingua franca or the common language of the people, and it should gradually replace English. Okay. Now, the reason why this has specifically been in the news is because of the three language formula that was talked about in the draft of the national education policy. Okay. So recently, if you've been following the news, you would have by now, I'm sure, read about the new education policy and what specifically the new education policy talks about. When its draft had come out in the beginning, it said that there are three languages that have to be followed in all states, and it said that the three language formula has to be followed. Now, the direct reference to Hindi wasn't given, but it was understood that the three languages would be A, Hindi, B, English, and C, the regional language of the respective states. Okay. Now, it's not that for the first time the national education policy has talked about it. When there was the national policy on education in 1968, they also said that we should teach in Hindi, we should teach Hindi across the states. Okay. So the status quo as of now is that states generally follow a two-language formula where they have English and then they have the regional language, which is compulsory in all the schools. Okay, so in a lot of Hindi-speaking states, it's not a problem because the regional language happens to be Hindi. But for a lot of non-Hindi states, the medium of education in the schooling is either English or the language of the state. Right now, whether Hindi is something that should be imposed on people or not, it's a policy question. I don't want to discuss on it because it's beyond the scope of a paper. You will never be asked to write a paragraph down. You'll have to read a paragraph and then you have to answer questions based on that. Okay. 1 second. 1 second. Yeah. So another piece of news that I want to talk about, and there are a couple of things that I want to talk about the judiciary now, because obviously you're preparing for the CLAT and you have to know these things. So recently, Vice President of India said that it's okay that we have a Supreme Court in Delhi, but not everyone can approach the Supreme Court in Delhi, and therefore there should be 4 regional benches of the Supreme Court. Okay. Now, if you look at Article 130 of the Constitution, it states very simply that the Supreme Court may sit at any other place apart from Delhi, okay, on the order of Chief Justice of India with the prior approval of the President of India, okay. Now, no constitutional amendment as such is required, only the order of the Chief Justice with the approval of the President is required, okay. Now, the Law Commission in the past has also said that Supreme Court should be divided into two categories of court. One part of Supreme Court should be a constitutional law court, and the second part of the Supreme Court should be the National Court of Appeal. Okay. Now, Supreme Court in 1986 itself, in one important judgment, had said that there should be a national. So it said that the constitutional court should continue to be in Delhi. However, there should be a National Court of Appeal with regional benches at Chennai, Mumbai, and Kolkata, right? Obviously, right? Because let's say there's a litigator in Karnataka. So he fights the case in Bangalore High Court, then he wants to appeal in the Supreme Court. Then he has to make it's a logistical nightmare for him or her to travel to Delhi and whenever that case is being heard, etc. Right? So rightly, so the Supreme Court itself has said that we should have multiple, let's say, regional benches, because it's much easier for a person in Bangalore to go to Chennai for appeal as opposed to come to Delhi and appeal. Okay. So in 2016 itself, the Supreme Court had referred to this matter to a constitutional bench for decision on the National Court of Appeal. The constitutional bench basically means bench of 5 judges or more. Okay. Now, another thing that has been in the news recently is the concept of Gram Nyayalayas. So recently, Supreme Court of India has directed the governments of all the states to establish Gram Nyayalayas, right? So if you have any idea about how law functions in the country, the biggest problem that we have, the two biggest problems that we have is, first, there is a high cost of litigation. And the and the second problem is that there is a pendency of cases in the court. So it's taking a lot of time for cases to be decided by courts. And there is this adage that you would have heard of, that justice delayed is justice denied. So that is effectively what is happening. Okay. So the center had enacted this law called the Gram Nyayalayas Act in 2008. Okay. And under the law, it said that more than 5,000 Gram Nyayalayas are supposed to be set up. So Gram Nyayalayas effectively would be Nyayalayas with its jurisdiction being larger panchayats. Okay. So now a sum of 14,000, 15,000 crore rupees was also set aside along with the Gram Nyayalayas Act to promote Gram Nyayalayas all across India. However, the present condition is that only 11 states have taken steps to, let's say, formulate and notify Gram Nyayalayas. And out of a target of 5,000 Gram Nyayalayas that was set up in 2008-2009, only 208 Gram Nyayalayas are functioning in the country. And in the Northeast, there is not even a single Gram Nyayalaya. Okay. So under the Gram Nyayalaya Act, the Gram Nyayalayas are supposed to exercise both civil and criminal jurisdiction. Okay. Now they can try criminal cases, civil suits, etc., which are specified in the Gram Nyayalayas Act of 2008. So they can effectively deal with all civil offences, and they can with civil suits. They can also deal with criminal offences, provided that the punishment is not death or imprisonment for life or imprisonment for a term exceeding 2 years. So for any matters in which the imprisonment is, let's say, 6 months, 1 year, 18 months or 2 years, that matter can be tried in the Gram Nyayalayas itself. And for any other matter beyond that, then you obviously have to go to the respective sessions court and high court, etc. Okay. Now, the beauty of Gram Nyayalayas Act is that Gram Nyayalayas are not bound by the rules of evidence that are provided in the Indian Evidence Act. Okay. So the rules of evidence are very, very strict. And that makes justice it makes justice inaccessible to people. Okay. And therefore, the Gram Nyayalaya Act says that if, let's say, small cases are going to be tried out in these Gram Nyayalayas, let's not have such strict and stringent procedural requirements. Let's ease the evidentiary requirements. However, principles of natural justice will continue to apply. Now, there are certain 5-6 principles of natural justice that's beyond the scope of this lecture. But if you want to read, you can quickly Google them. They're very simple to understand. Okay. Now, obviously, if there is any appeal against the judgment of a criminal case, then that will go to the court of session, and any civil case appeal will go to a district court. Okay. Now, the good thing about the Gram Nyayalayas Act is that it says that appeals have to be heard and disposed of within 6 months. So it basically wants justice to be delivered faster so that people can also get a sense of justice. And at the same time, it deals with the problem of pendency of cases in district courts, high courts, and Supreme Courts. Okay. Now, how much time do I have enough time? So the next topic small topic that I want to talk to you about is the topic of electoral bonds. Okay, so electoral bonds is not something very new. It was introduced in the Union Budget in 2017 and 18. The rationale that was given by the center was that if there is, let's say, regulation of election funding, if the fundings come through electoral bonds, then we can see and look at cleanup of election funding, right? And they can also protect the identity of the donor, so that, let's say, if some donor is donating to a political party and that political party does not win, some other political party wins, okay, then that other political party does not take revenge or exercise any form of vendetta against these donors. Okay, so let's look at some of the nitty-gritties of how these electoral bonds are supposed to function. So they have a shelf life of 15 days. Okay, so from the day that an electoral bond is purchased by the issuer, the person who's giving donation only has a period of 15 days to make that donation. So this is done so that these cannot be kept out separately, and donors cannot blackmail political parties and give them this carrot that, oh, see, I have already purchased this electoral bond, so now I have this electoral bond. If you do this 6 months down the line, then I will give this much money to your political party, right? So therefore, they've decided to make the lifespan very short. Now, who is eligible to buy electoral bonds? You have to be a citizen of India or a company that is incorporated in India. Again, you have to do proper KYC requirements, and then you have to make payments from a bank account. So basically, white money only can now be used. And obviously, white money can be only used to purchase electoral bonds. You can't go in and give cash and purchase an electoral bond. Okay. So, so the thing is, if you look at the value of electoral bonds, okay, they can be purchased in a multiple of 1,000 rupees, 10,000 rupees, 1 lakh, 10 lakh, and 1 crore rupees. Okay, and they are available from specific branches of State Bank of India. So when the government of India had come up with this, they had said that there are a lot of people in India who want to give these sums of money, but they are scared that their information vis-a-vis which party they are donating to might become visible to the political opponents, and they might, let's say, exercise some form of vendetta. But recently, why electoral bonds have been in the news is because there was an RTI which was filed, and the RTI came up with some startling revelations. Okay, so we remember that there are denominations ranging from 1,000 rupees to 1 crore rupees, right? Now, electoral bond with denomination of 1 crore rupees accounted for more than 91% of the amount raised. And the 4 cities, that is Mumbai, Kolkata, New Delhi, and Hyderabad, accounted for 83% of all the electoral bonds by value. So it effectively means that the people who are donating to these political parties continue to be big influential people. And the entire idea that regular people also want to donate to these political parties without the fear of harassment is not necessary and not really a well-founded idea. Okay. So this was something that you should, not this particularly, but this, one second, pictographical representation contains everything and anything that is important vis-a-vis electoral bonds, and this is something that you should focus on. Okay. Now, the next thing that I want to discuss with you is the national party status. So the Election Commission of India recently said that the National People's Party is now a national party, which making it the first party from the Northeast region to earn the status of a national party. Okay. Now it became the 8th national political party in the country. There are 7 other parties which have the designation of a national party. So the benefits of becoming a national party is that there are certain, let's say, relaxations in funding, campaigning rules, etc., broadcasting rules, etc., that are provided to the national political parties. Now, for a party to be recognized as a national political party, it has to fulfill any one of these 3 criteria. The first is that it has to secure 6% of votes in any 4 or more states at a general election to the Lok Sabha or Legislative Assembly. And in addition to it, it has to poll 6% of votes, and it has to win 4 seats in Lok Sabha from any state or states. Okay. Now, the second condition is if it wins 2% of seats in the Lok Sabha, and these candidates are elected from 3 separate states. And the fourth condition is that if it is recognized as a state party in 4 states. Now, the National People's Party became a national party on the last ground, that is recognition as a state party in 4 states. NPP was recognized as a state party in Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, Meghalaya, and Nagaland. Okay, therefore earning it the status of a national party. Yeah. So looking at the last topic of today is the interstate water disputes. Now, this is something I think on which there can be a very specific question, right? Because river disputes is something that has been in the news for the last 50 years. There is obviously and always a river dispute. A lot of these river disputes are still ongoing. Some of them have not been settled, and if they have been settled, the states are not very happy with it. So let's look at what is happening vis-a-vis river disputes in India. Okay. So recently, the Lok Sabha has passed the Interstate River Water Disputes Amendment Bill 2019, which the idea behind it is replace the Interstate Water Dispute Act of 1956. Now, before we look at this act, let us look at what the Constitution. Let's look at what the Constitution says about this. Arushi says, can you show the National Party slide once more? I mean, you can pause this video and watch it, Ayushi. It's, I think, live on YouTube also, so you won't waste other people's time. But you can get these slides on YouTube anyways, so I'm gonna skip and try to finish it on time, okay? If that's okay with you. Okay. So now let's look at interstate water dispute. So let's look at what the Constitution says. Okay. So under Article 262(1), it says that the Parliament can provide for adjudication of any dispute or complaint with regards to the use of water, distribution or control of water in any state, river or river valley. Okay. Now 262(2) says that the Parliament has the power to make a law that that neither the Supreme Court nor any other court shall exercise jurisdiction in respect of any such dispute. Okay. So under Article 262, based on these powers that are provided, two laws are enacted. The first law is the River Boards Act. 1 second. The first is the River Boards Act of 1956. 1 second. Okay. So it was enacted with the declaration that the center should take control of regulation. So the thing is that obviously if there is an interstate dispute, then the center is best positioned to, let's say, form a river board for management of that river, right? However, this act came out in 1956. People thought that there would be certain river boards set up by the center. However, it's been 70 years. Not a single river board has been constituted so far. Then they passed another act in 1956 known as the Interstate River Water Disputes Act of 1956. This is the act that is supposed to be done away with now. Now it gives the union government power to constitute tribunals to resolve the disputes between states. And this act also says that the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction over such disputes. Okay. Now, there are certain problems with the 1956 law. Okay, so 9 tribunals have been set up so far under the 1956 Act, and only 4 of them have given their awards. Now, one of these disputes, the Kaveri water dispute between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, it took a period of 28 years to settle. Okay, then another tribunal, that is the Ravi and Beas Water Tribunal. This was set up in 1986. And it has still not given the final decision. So therefore, the river disputes are carrying on for a very long time. Now, the minimum amount of time that a tribunal has taken to settle a dispute is 7 years. And this is the Krishna Water Dispute Tribunal 1976. Okay. Now, what this bill does is that it does a very interesting thing. It does away with all of these tribunals and it sets up only one national river water dispute tribunal. It also says that before going to the tribunal, there has to be a dispute resolution committee, which would try to solve the disputes that are arising between states, and they will try to resolve these disputes amicably by negotiating for 1 year. And then if an extension is required, they would take an extension for another 6 months. Now, obviously, if a matter has reached the state of dispute, I highly doubt that the dispute resolution committee is going to be successful, because we've seen in the last 70 years that these matters are highly political and emotional matters, and these don't get settled amicably. And that's the whole point as to why these tribunals exist. Anyways, so if, let's say, the DRC cannot settle these disputes, then the central government will refer the matter to the Interstate Water Disputes Tribunal. Okay. Then, as I told you, this act, what it does is it sets up only one tribunal. So all the cases that are going on in the remaining 5 tribunals will now be transferred to the national tribunal. Okay. So that's effectively what we have in polity. That's pretty much it. that I had to share with you. Okay. Cool. I hope that's enough. Yeah, Harsh, I'm pretty much done with this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for joining us and
Okay.
teaching us this important topic. And as I started from the beginning, that it's one of the most important subjects which is covered in law entrance examination. Thank you once again.